What of, therefore, the Russia-Ukraine situation? Because Operation Spiderweb by the Ukrainians was remarkable. Mm-hmm. And I think they are single-handedly demonstrating that modern warfare does not necessarily need big strategic assets like bombers. Obviously, they have a place, but you can do a lot with quite little.
Yeah.
What's your takeaways from Ukraine?
Well, I still think that Russia currently has the upper hand in that conflict. They do. And that's why Putin is quite content to sit back and not do anything that doesn't align with his belief that you have to get to the root cause of the problem. And again, this is my take on it, my personal take on it, that Trump saw Putin as a tough guy bro that he could deal with and cut a New York-style real estate deals. You take this, I take that, cut it 50-50, and we'll all walk away. And Putin isn't interested in a land for peace deal. He's already got the land. He's not going to give it back.
This is The Global Gambit.
2025, more than ever, seems to be a year of unprecedented changes. We talk about a new world order, but I think simply a new world disorder is more pertinent. From international conflicts and exchanges amongst countries that we have long feared but have finally come to a reality, and also macroeconomic shifts that, well, no one, and as my guest has said, just can't keep up. So if you're interested in Ukraine, Russia, economics, and just geopolitics more broadly, do stay tuned for this very exciting two-part conversation. Today, my guest is Frank Giustra, CEO of Fiore Group and co-chair of International Crisis Group. And Frank, I will say, just sort of off the part, you are the first person that we're doing an in-person live chat, which is exciting. But also the very first guest I ever had on the show. Viewers can go back to 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago. I was in Mexico and we did it over Zoom or something. Yeah. But here we are. And I think it's, I also haven't seen you for like 20 years. So lovely to do this in person. I mean, the first question really in this first half, I wanted to talk about peace and security. Right. And the first thing is simply, what do you think about the state of matters at the moment? Because it seems to me that we're not even great power competition anymore. We seem to be that Trump is wanting to buddy up with those other great powers. So is this a permanent change?
Nothing in this world is permanent. I've learned that a long time ago, but we have certainly... We're witnessing history. The old world order, as we knew it, as your parents knew it, is over. And I think it's over for good. What comes next is anybody's guess. But I suspect that we're going to go through a pretty messy transition, as always happens throughout history when you have a changing of the world order. And I think that my only hope is that it's done in a relatively peaceful manner, which is not always the case as history has taught us. So I think that as far as the West is concerned, they may still think they're the hegemon in the world, but that's quickly changing. I think they're still behaving in a way that they believe in the Western post-World War II order. But you just have to see what's happening in the rest of the world with the rise of the BRICS, with America looking inwards, America first policy, everybody else be damned. And, the China-U.S. rivalry, there's a change taking place and it's happening very quickly. And as I said earlier, I consider myself well informed. I'm part of the crisis group. I'm the chair of the crisis group, and obviously I do business all over the world. So, but even I can't keep up. You wake up in the morning, you read the news, and something else comes up. It's a very turbulent time.
Well, there was 2 specific examples, I think, of just how unusual it's become. Because in May we saw India and Pakistan have a severe escalation of strikes over Kashmir. But then we saw what some people are calling now the 12-day war between Iran and Israel. And both these events are, particularly Iran and Israel, I think, events that people have long feared and predicted, but they finally come to pass. And Iran's, lost all its idea of plausible deniability or ability to pretend that it doesn't have the ability to target Israel. And Israel's launched, an unprecedented set of campaigns against many different fronts. What do you take away from events if we focus on this Middle East for a second? What do you take away from that? that these things are happening?
Yeah, well, first let's just, the India-Pakistan thing, I don't think people really appreciate how dangerous a confrontation that is. With China backing Pakistan and U.S. backing India, both nuclear-armed states. So hopefully that won't bubble up again in anytime soon. The Middle East, man, I've been watching the Middle East since I was 10 years old. I remember the 1967 war, and I remember the 1973 Yom Kippur War when I was a kid. And at one point when I was in the movie business, my partner and I bought the movie rights to the book O Jerusalem, which told the entire story about the creation of the State of Israel. And we hired an Academy Award-winning writer to write the script. It never got off the ground, at least under us, it never got off the ground. But I learned a lot. I went to Israel, and I learned a lot about how this all came about. And I've been watching the Iran situation since they went through that coup in 1953, and then the Shah came in, and obviously backed by the United States, and then the revolution in '79. So watching all of this play out, and the fact that we at Crisis Group attempt to talk to all sides, and because if you ever want any hope for peace in any conflict, you have to understand both sides of it. You have to kind of ignore that the propaganda each side generates through their mainstream media, because they all do it. Okay, so to get down to the real facts, to understand how these conflicts arise, the reasons behind them, only if you really understand them can you truly find solutions. So I look at the Iran situation, and this 12-day war, which Trump, got. I think Trump did not want to attack Iran. That was not part of his plan. I know people believe that he did, but I think he saw Israel conduct a very successful initial attack, and he decided to pile in, and take the glory for it. But in his mind, that one attack by the U.S. was one and done. It was like, we'll do that. Now he doesn't even want to talk about it. It's like that's a future problem. We've obliterated their nuclear program, which is not. I don't think is accurate. I think it's misguided. I don't think they may have set him back a few months, but I think that prior to the attack, the Iranians moved that 400 kilograms of enriched uranium and probably hundreds of centrifuges to other locations throughout the country. So.
But can I ask you on that point about America, though? What does the American Strikes Operation Midnight Hammer demonstrate about America's capacity to do it if they want, right? There is no country like the United States that can pull out B-2 bombers and just coordinate. I mean, I have to be honest, that misdirection that Pete Hegseth, I think, said was quite remarkable. And I'm not endorsing it necessarily, but it's quite remarkable that the Chinese can't do that, can they?
I think they're catching up very quickly. In 2015, I wrote an article about what I thought was the greatest threat to global security in the 21st century, and I wrote about China-U.S. relations. And in that article, I pointed out that we tend to underestimate how quickly China's caught up technologically. I mean, in all aspects, not just in military, but in civil
EVs,
matters as well. There, AI, quantum communications.
DeepSeek.
I mean, their ability to robotics, you name it, and their electric vehicles are, in my opinion, far more advanced than, say, Teslas and cheaper. So don't underestimate China. And, they have hypersonic missiles. They can do all sorts of things to create just as much damage as the U.S. And I think they've caught up very quickly.
Fair enough.
So you can't really, I think it would be a mistake to underestimate taking on China by anybody. But yes, the U.S. is obviously the global military power, and they demonstrated that quite well. But listen, bombing a bunch of sites is one thing. Waging war is a completely different can of worms. And so, Iran is a country of 92 million people with,
very educated.
Very well educated. And, despite all you hear about, there being division in the country, of course there's division. There's division in every country. But this attack kind of flared up their nationalistic fervor. They're really, I think that the Iranians in general were not happy with the West and with the United States on this. And I don't think, obviously Israel would love regime change. they started with the nuclear, taking out the nuclear weapons, but they upsold it immediately to a regime change, and that's what Trump does not want to get involved with, despite what he says sometimes in his tweets, midnight tweets. But Israel is absolutely determined to drag the U.S. and they have been for the last 3 years to drag the U.S. into a direct war with Iran. And that would be catastrophic for everybody, I think, for the entire world if that were to happen. We at Crisis Group were very instrumental in the JCPOA in 2015 in, helping to give ideas on how to craft that agreement. And, Trump killed it. At the very least, there were a lot of holes in that agreement, but at least it prevented Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So what you have to ask yourself today, after this attack in Israel and the U.S., what do you think the Iranians are thinking now? What do you think their choices are, knowing that they certainly can't trust Israel? They don't trust the U.S. either. They thought that the U.S., all this talk of negotiation was a ruse for as a cover for the attack. And so if you were the Iranians, what would you do at this stage? I would think that they may be thinking of this as an existential threat to the regime. There's a definite campaign by Israel to take down the regime. And that's, and obviously Israel gets what they want usually from the U.S., maybe not in this case, but I think that one of the options that they must be seriously considering now is rushing towards weaponizing their uranium, because that's the only deterrence that you can really count on. I mean, look at North Korea. No one's ever attacked North Korea. Then look at Libya and Syria, and who gave up, and Iraq, who gave up their nuclear and weapons of mass destruction programs. Look what happened to them. So the Iranians are probably sitting back going, okay, this is not working. The negotiations aren't working.
But on that point, is that not like almost also ensure, because there's never going to be a ground assault. You can't ensure regime change through only an aerial campaign. You have to be on the ground to do that, right? So the Americans are never going to send in.
Absolutely not.
So so the Iranians don't have to rush to, unless a Navy SEAL group go in to assassinate Khamenei or something insane.
I think they're trying to do it through other covert means, trying to split the country and its ethnic groups into, to different warring parties, create internal discord, which they're very good at. They've done it in other countries for decades and decades. So to me, that would be the only way. Iran will want to continue to push the U.S. in being hostile to Iran. Israel does not want a U.S.-Iran deal. They don't want peace between the U.S. and Iran.
Bibi Netanyahu doesn't. The Israeli people.
Yeah,
I don't like the
these days, who knows? Okay, because really, but you think about it. There was a time when Israel was split over, Zionism and all of these things. But now, I think if you poll the Israelis, they're much in favor of the whole Gaza fiasco. And Bibi is actually polling very strong right now since the attack on Iran. He's doing a victory lap at the moment.
He does do well at survival, doesn't he?
Yeah, it certainly does, and it's certainly helped to keep the coalition together. Mm-hmm. So, I think that this ceasefire is just temporary. It's very fragile. I think you still have two hostile groups there that will find a way to re-engage at some point. Obviously, Iran has to get its its whole network back and running, and I'm not sure if it's been devastated forever. When you talk about Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and, everything, all the proxies that Iran had have been weakened, and so...
Insane what happened.
So that's another reason I think that Iran might be considering, its only option at this stage. What's its only option? If you got to think about it from their point of view.
No, for sure. And on that point, to pivot towards a segment that I know a lot of people are going to be particularly interested in, which is Russia and Ukraine. But as a prelude to that, I want to ask specifically about Russia, because I believe either yesterday or around the time of this recording, they have apparently recognized the Taliban, the first official government to do so. Okay, well, that's interesting. I have one theory as to why they're doing that, which is that they're losing options. They've lost Iran's power. Syria's gone. China's exploiting the hell out of them. North Korea is not exactly, global superpower. So Putin is getting a bit desperate. The economics, of which we'll cover in part 2 a bit, is looking pretty bad. What do you take away from Russia's ability to exert power in the Middle East /
Well, they obviously haven't been able to. They walked away from Syria in very short order when Israel attacked, and Iran. They didn't come to Iran's aid, which much to Iran's chagrin, and they were hoping to get some help from Russia, and they didn't get any. So, and China's always playing the long game. They're staying neutral with respect to wars. They're staying neutral. They took a page out of America's book from 200 years ago. Stay out of everybody else's wars. Build up your economic strength. Build up your military strength, and don't blow your wad on senseless wars. Whereas the U.S. 25 years, between $7 and $9 trillion spent on wars in the Middle East. That's bankrupt, in my opinion. That's gone a long way to bankrupt America, and China's not making that mistake. So anyways, but getting back to Russia, I think Russia has enough of it on its hands with the Ukraine war. It spread too thin to help Iran or Syria in any meaningful way. So, that part still needs to play out, and I've obviously thoughts about that. But you're right. So they haven't been of any real use to Iran.
Would you unpack a bit more the Chinese-Russian relationship, because I think it's one of the most over-embellished, exaggerated dynamics of international relations, right?
But you have to understand, every country on the planet only cares about its own interests. I mean, Kissinger said it best. He says, America doesn't have allies and friends, it only has interests. He was speaking the truth. But you can say that about China, about Russia, or anybody. So it's a marriage of convenience for China and Russia to come together to be a counterweight to the West. That's all they're doing.
Sure.
China has its own ambitions, which have nothing to do with Russia. It has its own ambitions about its own economic growth and global power. So, these relationships, and if you study any conflict throughout history, wars throughout history, everybody changes sides all the time. I mean, how many times have we been friends with Russia and then enemies with Russia? And so the Taliban, so Russia attacked Afghanistan in 1979. Now they're making friends with the Taliban. So, it's just, the whole world is the problem with the world is run by humans. And humans, at the end of the day, the only reasons we have war, you can argue about, trying to acquire somebody else's resources, but at the end of the day, it's people, it's power and ego. It's about power. It's about maintaining power. And that goes for the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, everybody.
So what of, therefore, the Russia-Ukraine situation? Because Operation Spiderweb by the Ukrainians was remarkable. And I think they are single-handedly demonstrating that modern warfare does not necessarily need big strategic assets like bombers. Obviously, they have a place, but you can do a lot with quite little. Yeah. What's your takeaways from Ukraine's resilience?
I still think that Russia currently has the upper hand in that conflict. They do. And that's why Putin is quite content to sit back and not agree to do anything that doesn't align with his belief that you have to get to the root cause of the problem. And Trump, who came in campaigning on solving the Ukraine war in 24 hours, he's and again, this is my take on it, my personal take on it, that Trump saw Putin as a tough guy bro that he could deal with and cut a New York style real estate deals. You take this, I take that, cut it 50-50, and we'll all walk away. And Putin isn't interested in a land for peace deal. He's already got the land. He's not going to give it back. He's not giving it back. That is absolutely been accepted by all sides now, that they're not going to get that land back. Okay.
Well, not in the short term, but what about longer term?
Yeah, but long term we're all dead. I mean, in the long term, lots of things happen in this world. I mean, but I'm saying to get to a peace deal, a near term peace deal, the land, that I don't think that's going to be debated. I think what Putin wants, what I think the main thing he wants is to get to the root of the problem, which was the threat of the NATO expansion. And and again, as I said earlier, you have to always look at both sides of the debate and understand how we got here. And the problem with Western mainstream media is they give you the Western perspective only, and they kind of forget to tell you the parts that really. Putin's not a madman. He didn't wake up one morning going, "I'm just going to take over Ukraine." There was a process that led up to this point, and it had to do primarily with NATO expansion, and Ukraine being the final red line that he wouldn't accept, and he used all the excuses he used about to invade Ukraine, Nazification and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, it all happened because of the promise that America made in the 90s. Not one further inch east was the promise that America made about, and what happened since. How many countries have been invited to NATO, all kind of crouching into Russia's borders, and Ukraine was the final straw. And then you look at it again from...
But wasn't that a verbal promise, not an actual written promise?
No, it was a verbal promise.
So if it's not written, therefore it's not ratified.
Yeah, I know, but again, fair enough. But if you're sitting in Putin's shoes, and because, by the way, Russia initially wanted to be part of NATO, and the U.S. would never allow.
Well, they're part of the Partnerships for Peace initiative still.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that and then you scroll forward to the maiden coup in 2014, and Russia feels that the West covertly, the Western intelligence, the U.S. and Britain, basically created that protest and revolt which removed Yanukovych. So he's got his point of view. And obviously the West has their point of view, but at the end of the day, I still believe that in his mind he's got the upper hand, and that's why he's in no hurry. And for his part, Trump has given a tacit quasi-green light to Putin to continue. He gives lip service to a peace agreement. This war is horrible, should end, but now he's cutting off military aid to the Ukraine. He doesn't care about the Ukraine. And so now Europe is left on its own to deal with this, what they perceive to be a Russian aggression. So, and that's changing. Later we'll talk about macroeconomics of all of this, but 5% of GDP on military spending by Europe, obviously only 3.5% of which is direct military spending, the other 1.5% for infrastructure. But, If they go through with that in 5 years' time, by 2030, that's about $13 trillion of spend. $13 trillion by Europe. Okay.
Well, I wanted to ask you about Europe.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying. So, but anyways, the point is that Putin is focused on Ukraine at the moment. That's why he can't help Iran and others.
But isn't that too much of a risk? He's putting all his eggs in one basket of Ukraine. That he's losing Russia's global influence and near abroad elsewhere. China's beginning to encroach on the southeastern corner with man.
Yeah, I don't buy that. I'm sorry. I just don't buy that that's happening. I think that when the Russian invasion happened, if you look at just the facts, I'm just giving the facts, and the West tried to sanction and boycott Russia and get the rest of the world to fall in line, the rest of the world did not fall in line.
Oh, for sure. No, there's plenty of people who support
100 countries
Russia.
increased their trade with Russia. So I don't think... If you just listen to the Western perspective, then you don't listen to the Global South. I listen a lot to what the leaders of the Global South are saying. And, they see the Western hypocrisy in all of this rules-based international order. They've seen through it. And so, and one of the greatest examples is the West's take on the attack by Russia on Ukraine versus Israel's attack on Gaza. Two similar situations, and the Israelis get no criticism from the U.S. and much of Europe. If you, Ireland and Spain and others are very much against it, but that's where the hypocrisy comes through, and the Global South does not like it. So they want to be. Most of the Global South would like to have relationships with both Russia and the West. Mm-hmm. That's what they want. They want a peaceful coexistence, but they're not picking sides. So you have to look at what the rest of the world is doing. And I don't believe that China is currently taking any advantage of Russia except buying oil at a discount, which is great for China. But I don't think I don't see any danger of China taking geopolitical advantage of the situation on Russia at this moment in time. Now it may change in the future, but I don't see it. I don't know
You
where
don't
you saw it.
see Russia increasingly a client state of China.
Well, in a sense, until this war is over, it is the major buyer of Russian products, being energy mostly.
$240 billion worth of trade.
Yeah.
Not
But
exactly supportive for
yeah,
Russia.
but Russia also sells to the rest of the world as well. It's not just weapons and oil and minerals, food, wheat. So I don't see that yet. Now listen, the global situation is very fluid. Okay, and so anything can happen. But I personally don't see that yet.
So as we shift to part two, one last question. Prospects for peace, or generally the role of the UN. I believe in it in principle. Obviously, there's a lot of hypocrisy and double standards there, or inefficacy. But is it still relevant?
I disagree. I don't think the UN has any power whatsoever with respect to global peace. You have the Security Council, 5 permanent members, each with a veto, and 3 of them being Russia, China, and the U.S. They're impotent. They can't do anything. They can make all the statements. You got Guterres out there saying all the things he needs to say about, the atrocities that are taking place in Gaza and, how Israel is acting in a criminal fashion. Does that change anything? No.
But can the UN be reformed, or that's the end of it? Drop
Well,
it and we live in anarchy?
I asked that very question a while back to people that know a lot more about this stuff than I do, people that were the Undersecretary of the UN, someone that sits on the Crisis Group board. And technically, yes, but it would have to be a complete revamp. And you basically have to start from scratch and redesign a UN, or whatever you're going to call it next, that is multipolar. And the problem with the UN is it was fabricated after World War II, and the victors of World War II basically made the rules. That's why you have the veto powers on the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So that it's no longer post-World War II, and now we're in a new world where China wants to see a more multipolar world, and they're fighting for that. Obviously, they want to be dominant as well in their region, but they don't want to see one hegemon running the entire planet for obvious reasons. So, yeah, I think it would have to be redesigned. I don't think you can reform it.
On that true note, we'll be back for part 2, everybody. See you then.